Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Two Tutors Talking. I am your lovely host, Audrey Codner, and we are actually having a special addition to our Two Tutors Talking tribes. So I want to kind of break it down. We all have different types of students from different realms of the world, and usually we have to have like a special population where we need to break things down either a little slower, a little faster, or maybe just rearrange some things so everyone has their proper thinking. So, what we're doing today, we have a special, wonderful guest, Miss Jess Arce, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on at 3D Learning Experts. Hello, Jess. How are you?
Hi, Audrey. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, not a problem. I'm so glad that you are here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what are you doing at 3D Learning?
So, I am the CEO and the director of 3D Learning Experts, and the 3D stands for dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. So, we specialize in helping students who are struggling in school with their reading and spelling, their writing and note taking, or their math, and they don't learn the traditional way. And we teach them using either an Orton Gillingham based program or all of our programs are multi-sensory.
That's awesome because I know there's a lot of good friends of mine that have like tutoring companies that really specialize for special educators. But then there's also a lot of tutors that are relatively new to breaking down some of those concepts. But what are some of the things that you've been seeing with your practice?
The way that the world is today, people with dyslexia are are viewed very differently than back during the time of Leonardo da Vinci, where people had mentors. So many times our students, parents don't know that their kids have dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia. They don't understand why their kid is struggling in school. Usually their child is a bright child or above average intelligence. Think of people like Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, Walt Disney. Many of these men became very famous, right? Household names, but they were kicked out of school or asked to not return in the case of Albert Einstein as children because they were considered unteachable. And it's not that they're unteachable. It's just that they need to be taught differently than the way the traditional school system teaches. And my children were that. Three of my four children did not thrive in the traditional educational system. We tried public school, we tried private school, none of it helped. And then I finally homeschooled my three younger children because they just were not thriving in traditional school. So parents typically are at their wits' ends. They don't know why their child is not able to multiply or read or comprehend a story that they're reading, or why they can't take their ideas out of their mind and put it down on paper. They can communicate well with someone one on one or even in a group setting, but they can't write down anything. And these are some of the characteristics of our kids with dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia. And so very often people will have all three, or they'll have dyslexia and dyscalculia. A lot of times people don't know what dysgraphia or dyscalculia are, and they think they know what dyslexia is. So if I could tell you quickly what those three
Sure,
things are, I think that would be
please.
really helpful for your audience. So number one, dyslexia is not reversals. That's what most people think dyslexia is. The reversals are actually often something else. It could be vision processing challenge. It could be Irlen syndrome. Some people do have reversal issues, and that is what dyslexia is considered to be. But dyslexia is difficulty with words. Literally, that's what dyslexia means. Dys means not or difficulty, and lexia means words. So that's difficulty with reading words, difficulty with spelling words, and difficulty with communicating words. Dysgraphia is difficulty with writing. Graphia is writing. So it could be really poor handwriting, or it could be like struggling to get those thoughts out of your mind and onto the paper. And a lot of times they'll say, well, just use talk to text. Well, that's really hard for someone with dysgraphia because they can get frustrated because the talking to text thing doesn't always get their information right. And then they can't remember what they were trying to say. And so they become really frustrated by that. And then dyscalculia falls into your area. Calculia, right? Calculating is math. So dyscalculia is difficulty with math. And our students who have dyscalculia, math is like a foreign language to them. They just cannot understand the concept of, some of them can't understand the concept of addition. The very first student I had who had dyscalculia, she was 18 years old and could not add 4 plus 6. But very often they can't multiply. And when my oldest one with dyscalculia was in school, they would just say, just have her practice the speed tests. Just every day do the speed test. Well, that didn't help her learn. We teach our students stories. They memorize a story, like the sixth grade class played musical chairs for 24 hours. And that helps them remember 6 times 4 is 24. 4 times 6 is 24. 24 divided by 4 is 6. And, that works so much better for someone with dyscalculia or dyslexia, because a lot of times people with dyslexia have difficulty with multiplication as well. And then algebra is a huge challenge for them, although geometry is not. Geometry is shapes, and it's concrete, right? They can see the shape, they can understand it. Algebra is these random letters thrown in with these numbers, and it's like, what am I supposed to do with that X? I don't know. So it's too arbitrary, and it doesn't make sense to them that algebra is usually the biggest problem for someone with dyslexia or dyscalculia.
Yes. And I mean, I always, especially with math, when it comes to multiplication, as you said, a lot of them don't know how to read the multiplication chart. And a lot of people are like, well, I just give them a chart. And I'm like, but that doesn't help them because they still don't understand the whole connection to it. And especially when you go from elementary to middle, you use the X to represent multiplication. But then when they get into middle school, it's not an X anymore. It's like a box or a blank space. And then they move from that to algebra, where X is supposed to be a variable. And you'll actually see, I used to see high school students that will put like X times 7, they'll say XX7. I'm like, why are we using double X's? What's going on? They're like, it just says X times 7. And I'm like, you're still thinking that that X is representing multiplication. And I still have students that are in 7th grade that are just like, I'm stuck. I don't know what 7 times X is or what 7 times is supposed to be. I don't know what's timesing. I'm like, because it's not times, it's an X, it's an unknown variable. And they're like, oh, and then they can continue on because they get those little blocks. But I mean, I totally understand, especially what a lot of people say, dysgraphia. They're like, oh, they can't do graphs. Like, no, that's not what it means. But to have this information and to kind of see, like, sometimes teachers will say, well, your child struggles with, putting their thoughts together, but they're really good at telling the story and they can really hold on to the thing. So I always say, well, teacher, hello, why don't you assess them differently? Why not, take them maybe after class, or maybe while the rest of the class is doing something, you pull them to the back to assess them that way. And sometimes we're just so strict with it has to be a paper and pencil test. And sometimes oral presentations are just as good, as not sometimes better, because now the kid has to understand the concept as well as doing the application. So, like, do you think, like, I think my problem is when it comes to, I still feel that public schools, based on my experience, they have, like, because we had the whole FRAP, free access to public education, and there are some resources that they have. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but again, we were talking earlier, and you're like, well, Audrey, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm in Maryland. And she's like, well, I'm in California. And can you kind of like reiterate what you said about that? Because I think this is going to be key for a lot of educators to hear.
Yeah, well, so you had mentioned that parochial and private schools tend to not have the same knowledge as public schools. And that's where I asked where you are from, because California, the teachers in public school don't have knowledge of what dyslexia is either. The East Coast, if you look at where the most amount of dyslexia private schools are, or dyslexia specialty schools, most of them are in New York. Some are in Vermont. There are very few as you start to move out west. We had looked at one for my youngest son when we moved to California before I started tutoring. And that program didn't have enough dyslexic people that they started including students with other learning challenges. And so then there was huge behavioral problems. And so there just wasn't a lot of success coming out of that school. I actually, my son didn't end up going there. And when I started my tutoring business right down the street from there, I would get students who the parents pulled them out of this specialty school because there were so many behavioral problems. So my point was, the only school in Southern California at the time that offered dyslexia specialized instruction was not very successful. Where on the East Coast, I interviewed someone for my podcast who is the headmaster of a boarding school for people strictly with dyslexia, and they're able to, support enough students in a boarding school setting. My mom was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 40s, and in Connecticut, she went away to a school in New York where they were helping her in the 40s. So the West Coast is really far behind from the East Coast. And if you look at the quality of public schools in general, from state to state, like 1 to 50, the East Coast have the top 10 schools. We lived in Texas, and Texas was like 35 in, 1 being the best, and 50 Nevada, where we also lived, being the worst. So Nevada and Mississippi have flip-flopped to being the one or the other, the worst public schools in America. Now, Mississippi has been working hard to change that. And so their way of trying to improve their public schools is to provide testing for children in kindergarten and first grade, dyslexia testing, if they notice something with the students. So there's definitely a discrepancy between the East Coast and the West Coast of the knowledge in the educational system, the means of assistance. When my kids lived in Texas in the early 2000s, we moved there in like 2005. And we left there in 2011. So that's not right, because we were there 8 years. But anyway, my math isn't right. But my two kids with profound and severe dyslexia were pulled out of class during English time, and they went to a small group dyslexia class, which was amazing. Not as good as one-on-one instruction is, but I mean, it was great for a public school to be offering that. They were probably the only state at the time doing that, and that was in Colorado. New York is supposed to be implementing a program for all students to get an Orton Gillingham based type of instruction, because the mayor, who I don't know what's up with him right now because he got indicted for something, but he's dyslexic. And so that was something good that he did, was trying to get all of the schools in New York City to help dyslexic kids, because there's no reason why elementary school kids, they can't all get the right kind of instruction, where if you have dyslexia, you're going to learn to read. And if you don't have dyslexia, you're still going to learn to read.
Right. Right. And that's the whole thing. Like, I know parents, you're doing the best you can. I'm hoping you're taking all this information in and you're like, oh, this is always something good to know. Especially from a lot of my clientele. Like, I have kids that are public, parochial, and private, a couple. And I've noticed that there's always a struggle with, especially my parochial school kids. Like, some of the things, some of the supports that they can use, like even having like maybe study guides, because some schools, they don't do study guides for tests or examinations. So the kids have no idea what's going to be on the test and they have nothing to review. And when they say just look at your notes, but when you look at kids' notebooks, it looks like a tsunami hit it because there's like no organization. So, and that's part of the reason why I designed my math notebook, because I'm like, a lot of my kids just needed that. Like, I need a quick place to look for my formulas. I need a quick place to look for what are the steps.
Yeah.
And then also with the parochial schools, it's not like they're not teaching, but I think, like you said, with California, they probably didn't have to do. I know in the public school sector, like we had to take classes for special education. Maybe a lot of our parochial school teachers did not have to, or private school did not have to. So they think that every kid should learn exactly the same. I'm giving them the same instruction, but that's not the case. We
Yeah.
all learn differently. Even as adults, we all learn differently. Um, Going with this whole tutoring program. For me, doing the tutoring business, I wasn't born and raised to run a business, but I had to learn things. And a lot of things are dealt with in chunks. But it just seems like a lot of people are not taking it um, into fruition about helping our special ed population, because they can still learn. It just takes them a little longer for processing or just understanding or another way to assess them. And this is where I think your business is exactly what maybe not even parents, maybe some other educators need to do to help educate their teachers as well.
Absolutely. Because when my daughter was 2.5, I was a preschool teacher, and she couldn't do basic things like cut with scissors or draw pictures at like 4. And so since she was 2.5, I have been trying to figure out what her deficit was. And the school teachers had no clue. We lived in Las Vegas at the time, and in kindergarten, her teacher wrote a note on her paper, you can do better than this. And I'm like, she can't even read that. So who's that for? It was like, I felt like it was a message for me, like my kid wasn't doing her best. And so I pulled her out of school and I attempted to homeschool her, but I had no clue how to homeschool. And I had 2 crying babies and I had a real estate business. So it was just, it was a fail. And so we put her back into a different school. And so then they told us to hold her back. I'll hold her back. She'll, get more time. Holding a child with dyslexia back they don't need more time to be taught the same way. So that was no benefit. But back then I didn't know any better. And I thought the educators knew better than I did. So I followed their advice and we held her back. And so she was the oldest kid always in her class because her birthday was March. So she was already an older student. And then she was a year and a half older than all her classmates. So she never improved, but now she was the oldest kid. And, that was an extra layer of discomfort for her. So when we moved to Texas, we were only there 1 week and her teacher said she's dyslexic because the teachers in Texas were educated on what dyslexia looked like. And it really does not take a whole lot when you know what dyslexia looks like to determine it's dyslexia. I can tell from a 30-minute phone call, the first 15 minutes, the parents are telling me about their child. I can tell if it's dyslexia or not, 90% of the time, based on what the parent is telling me that their child is going through. So I had no clue what dyslexia looked like before, but now, it's easy for me. My mom, who was diagnosed with dyslexia, was a teacher in New York City, and she had no clue what dyslexia looked like in anybody because she didn't educate herself as to what dyslexia was. She just knew that was her label. And she knew she had to work harder, but she didn't know, she can't alphabetize anything without going through the entire alphabet. That's because of her dyslexia. She didn't know that she gets lost all the time because of her dyslexia. She said to me, "Oh, I only had a couple of students who were dyslexic." She was a teacher for 25 years, and 8 of those 25 years, she was an art teacher. She had to have had, 1 in 5 people has dyslexia. So that means, she had to have had hundreds of students who were dyslexic walk through her door and she had no clue.
And that happens a lot in our classrooms, like there may be some parents that may see certain patterns or may see certain things, but they don't want to label their child with a special ed. Like, I don't want my child to be special ed. I want them to advance. I want them to grow. But how can we, let's put it this way, like, what are some things that, parents should look for? Like that will kind of say, you know what, maybe I should go take them to the doctor and literally say, this is what I'm seeing. So what are some things that parents could look for?
Well, first of all, the doctor's not going to help you. It's not like ADHD where you go to the doctor and you fill out a form. I don't want to forget to talk about something that you brought up. So let me talk about that first, and then we'll go into it. Okay. No so when my daughter was young, I remember people would say, "Oh, you don't want to get them in special ed because it stays with them for the rest of their life. It's like a scarlet letter." It's not a scarlet letter if they qualify for special ed. First of all, you don't have to accept any services that you don't want your child to have. You as a parent have the ultimate say of what your child does or does not do. You may have to stand up and advocate hard for your child with the school, unfortunately, but you ultimately have the right. And it's not a bad thing that your child might stay in special ed for the rest of their lives, because if they need the accommodations, special ed can be really beneficial. My youngest son is now in college, and when we first registered him at college, we went to the Student Disability Service Center because you need to register them before they get started, and we were able to get him a pen that records in the class, and so he doesn't have to take notes. It does it for him, and he can give the teachers a note so that he has more time on tests, and all of these things to make him more successful if he chooses to use them. He doesn't have to. It's an option. So having the special ed for the rest of their lives is not necessarily a bad thing. And if your child outgrows or no longer needs the special ed services, then you just opt out of them. Or, or if they don't need the services, then the school will definitely stop, because the school doesn't want to pay for anything extra if they don't have to. So that's something I just wanted to address, because